150 years ago, there are lots of hidden corners and streets so dark in old New York, you had to hope the good guys in law enforcement were there to watch your back. But what if there were two sets of good guys?
April and May of 1857, there were two different police forces on the streets of New York, and that didn't go well.
A lot of time was spent on the two police forces battling one another, and the results were that crime ran rampant for that year.
And did you know America's top gangster helped win World War II?
Lucky Luciano sent word to the capo mafiosi over in Sicily to help the Allies when they landed in Sicily. And then that kind of gave him a get-out-of-jail card.
How does a mafia don run a war from a jail cell? How did New York end up with two police departments? And who managed to kill the city's most vicious assassin the same night he was guarded by an entire police detail? We'll find out as we explore some of the secrets of New York. (1857). The Civil War is still years away. James Buchanan becomes president. Here in New York, half the city's population lives below 14th Street so they can get to work. Waves of immigrants swell the city's population, many of them poor and Irish, crowded into neighborhoods like the Five Points, the worst slum in America. A wealthy shipping merchant named Fernando Wood becomes mayor of New York by promising big reforms. But his changes turn out to be a one-way street.
He very ostentatiously launched a crackdown on prostitution, on saloons that were open on Sunday, which was against the law, on gambling, but it was a very selective crackdown. People who were of his political faction, people who were making payments, weren't subject to this crackdown.
That meant saloons in poor neighborhoods connected to Tammany Hall, which was the political machine that ran Wood's Democratic Party, weren't subject to closure or police harassment. What was worse, Wood started filling the ranks of the police department with his own people.
And from Albany's perspective, this was scary because it really looked like you had a mayor who was having his own private security force.
Fernando Wood blocked a state law that would have cut down on liquor sales. That won him a lot of friends in neighborhoods like the Five Points. It also made him a lot of enemies in Albany.
The legislature was afraid of the city and of the police department. So what they did was do away with the city police and start their own state police force. The state-controlled police force was called the Metropolitan Police, and the regular New York City police force was called the Municipal Police.
In the spring of 1857, it was chaos in the city streets. A Metropolitan policeman would arrest a gang member. Then, an hour later, a municipal policeman would arrive and free the man. Really convenient if you were a criminal, not so great for law and order.
When one policeman would say, this is a gang member, and another policeman would testify saying this is an upstanding member of the community, what is a court supposed to do?
So where are we going to get a group of people that are...
Just how confusing was it? We asked Mike Cronin, former director of New York City's Police Museum.
Who is your group? The Irish.
So each police force had its own badge.
Correct. The two forces had their own separate badge or shield, as we call them in New York. This is the municipal police, the old police, and it has the city seal on it. And this is the Metropolitan Police, and it did not have the city seal on it.
So this stalemate between the Metropolitans and the municipals, how did it end?
The whole controversy started when the street cleaning commissioner died. The mayor appointed a new person for that job. The problem was that the governor also appointed someone to that job. So when the governor's appointee came to show up for work and take his place, he was told the job was already filled. The mayor then ordered the municipal police to put him from the building. And at this point, the street commissioner, the captain, and 20 Metropolitan police officers were given a nice little beating and thrown down the steps of City Hall.
A warrant was sworn out against Fernando Wood for assault, But someone had to deliver it to City Hall and confront the mayor.
And it just so happens that George Washington Walling, a captain of the new police force, was present. And they said, this is just the man we need. We want you to go serve a warrant on the mayor. He took the warrant and proceeded to City Hall. He's led past and into the mayor's office. The mayor says, sir, what will you have? Walling replies, sir, I'm here for your arrest. Wood screams out, I will not submit. I do not recognize you as an officer. I do not recognize the Metropolitan Police. I refuse to submit, and I will not be taken.
After Captain Walling was thrown out of the mayor's office, 50 Metropolitan policemen showed up to force their way back in. Hundreds of municipal police poured out of the building to stop them. This secret of New York is that right here, on the steps of City Hall, two separate police forces punched and clubbed each other in the Great Police Riot of 1857. What happened in the police riot? Give me the details.
50 officers are met by 800 municipal police that are barricaded in the building, and they set upon the 50 police officers from the Metropolitan Police Force, and these poor people are beaten to a bloody pulp. City Hall Park is awash in blood after this riot.
So in the end, who won?
Well, immediately the municipal police won. However, the 7th Regiment of the National Guard just happened to be marching down Broadway. And the troops marched into City Hall Park. They fixed their bayonets and pointed everything towards the mayor's office. At this point, George Matsell, who was the chief of the municipal police, looked out the window and told his men, we're beaten, we can't do anymore.
The riot didn't stop Fernando Wood from being elected mayor again or from serving several terms in Congress. The police would answer to Albany for another 13 years until William Boss Tweed brought them back under city control in 1870. And Irish gangs moved out of poverty and into the middle class as the 20th century brought changes to the city.
The earlier gangs were street thugs who were seen nostalgically as two-fisted brawlers who weren't in it for the money. And by 1910, that was already gone, and crime was becoming a business.
In the early 20th century, the number of new immigrants from Sicily was at an all-time high. One of them, a young man named Salvatore Lucania, would grow up to become America's top gangster. He was better known as Lucky Luciano. In those days on the Lower East Side, control of the streets would shift block by block. Pool halls and candy stores became the incubators for a new generation of criminals.
Luciano lived on East 10th Street, and he became a runner for Meyer Lansky, Arnold Rothstein, also Bugsy Siegel, and Irish mobsters. And that's why he had so much power, because everybody felt more or less comfortable with Luciano.
As he began to rise, he worked for a fellow named Joe the Boss Masseria, who was the head Italian gangster in Manhattan. Lucky began figuring out, like any ambitious young man, how he could rise in the organization. Well, one way you moved up in a gang was to create a vacancy at the top, persuade the boss to take early retirement the mob way.
Lucky Luciano arranged for his boss to have lunch at a Coney Island restaurant. Official accounts don't list Luciano as being present that day, but the secret is he was there. He stayed after the meal to play cards with Joe the Boss Masseria. Newspapers reported the old boss died while holding the ace of spades in his hand. Of course, that's an unlucky card.
When the police came, Lucky was crying and saying, who could have killed poor Joe? Who wanted to kill poor Joe? Well, the guy who wanted to kill poor Joe was Lucky Luciano.
The next boss who took over didn't like sharing profits, so Luciano arranged a second early retirement party. Now, with Luciano as boss, New York City's underworld got organized in a brand new way.
Luciano is given credit for essentially establishing the 5 families in New York. They realized that syndicate crime was the way of the future. Why fight each other when we can carve out sections of the city, carve out various crimes that we can commit, loan sharking, gambling, etc., and protect our own as opposed to fighting with each other.
With the 5 families working together, money started rolling in. By 1935, Luciano's empire was worth tens of millions. And in another secret of New York, he lived at the Waldorf Towers as Mr. Charles Ross. Narcotics, extortion, and gambling had always been profitable, as well as prostitution. But prostitution provided a way for an ambitious prosecutor named Thomas Dewey to put Luciano behind bars.
Dewey saw him as a perfect target. Dewey was special prosecutor. Dewey was put into office to attack the mob, so what better target than Luciano?
The New York District Attorney calls for the capture of America's most sought gangster.
Thomas Dewey presented evidence at the trial that Luciano was personally running a huge prostitution ring, but his witnesses were weak. Luciano's mistake was to take the stand in his own defense.
My personal opinion is that his ego got the best of him and decided that he was going to get on the stand to talk his way out of this predicament that he was in. And Dewey was able to cross-examine him and catch him on certain lies, particularly about his past criminal history. Once the jury saw that Luciano was a liar and was caught in this lie, that kind of sealed his fate.
In 1936, Luciano was found guilty on every count of the indictment. He was sentenced to 30 years hard labor at the maximum security facility at Dannemora in upstate New York. It was known to the underworld as Siberia.
It was quite a harsh sentence, but Dewey was intent upon breaking the structure of organized crime in New York, and that was one way to do it, was to get the boss and take him out of circulation.
Prison didn't stop Luciano. From his cell, he secretly ran the mob through his 2 lieutenants, Vito Genovese and Frank Costello. But 6 years would pass before the government realized it needed Lucky's help. It was just after the shock of Pearl Harbor and months of deadly attacks by the German Navy all along the east coast of the United States.
American sailors were washing up on shore. There was a spate of rumors about German submarines that were entering into the Hudson River, and actually it seems that they did get very, very close.
The lights from New York City's skyline could silhouette ships that were offshore and make them easier prey for U-boats. So in 1942, at the insistence of the Army, the city imposed what was called a dim-out. Office buildings could not have lights on at night over 15 stories. The Statue of Liberty's torch was essentially put out. The gold leaf dome of the federal courthouse was painted black, and of most pronounced, the neon signs in the Great White Way in Times Square were out for the duration of the war.
People were getting killed, ships were being sunk, and it was a major problem for the war effort. The thought by naval intelligence in the U.S. and other parts of military intelligence was that if they approached the people who controlled the docks, they might be able to solve this problem.
Then, at the height of New York City's wartime fear, the French luxury liner Normandy caught fire while moored at Pier 88. She was one of the most beautiful passenger ships ever built, but when France fell to the Nazis, the Normandy was turned into a U.S. troop ship. The blaze spread rapidly, and as fireboats sprayed water into her seaward side, the ship capsized. It was a disaster.
The thought was that it was German submarines that had sunk the Normandy. There is some school of thought that the acetylene torches actually caused the ship to catch fire and then sink. I don't think any of us will ever know the answer to that secret of New York, but that incident, I think, amped up the need to have somebody intercede to try to get the German submarine problem under control, and they went to the mob.
The U.S. Navy decided that it was worth it because they were faced with such a serious problem with German saboteurs bombing our ships that they were ready to involve the mafia.
And they first went to a guy named Sachs Lanza, who was in charge of the Fulton Fish Market and that portion of the East Side docks. Very colorful character, very brutal, and Lanza told them that he only had a limited control of the docks and that they would have to go to Luciano. And Luciano, although he was in jail, was still in control of Italian-American organized crime.
Lucky Luciano claimed the Normandy fire was ordered by his mafia friend, Albert Anastasia, to spring Luciano from jail. But of course, Luciano was a notorious liar. What did happen was that Luciano was transferred to a prison closer to the city, and a series of secret meetings began.
These prison meetings were attended by quite a mixed bag. There were mafia figures, there were U.S. naval officials, and there were actually members of the team who had sent Luciano to jail in the first place.
The deal and the arrangement that they had was very simple. The mob passed the word that those on the docks, the stevedores and the people who worked on the docks, would keep their ears open, listen for the kind of information that would be passed on to German spies. That was one thing. The mob also provided intelligence agents with ID cards and jobs and union cards and positions on the docks. And last but not least, they also came to an agreement that there would be no strikes. There would be no labor interruptions, because if there were strikes and labor interruptions on the docks, it would stem the tide of the shipping and wouldn't allow products to get to where they needed to go. People who did not play along were killed. It's as simple as that. So that's how powerful Luciano was.
As a government report would later confirm, Luciano did help the war effort. There was no sabotage on the city's docks, and German attacks on the Atlantic coast died out. Luciano even helped the Allied invasion of Sicily through his contacts with the Italian mafia. Then, a few years later, it came time for the government to pay Luciano back.
Once the war was over, Luciano and his lawyer asked for their reward. But the deal was, okay, we will get you out of jail, but you are going to be deported for the rest of your life to Italy. He settled in Naples, where he spent most of his life.
When Thomas E. Dewey signed the parole papers, he might have been thinking that it would be very helpful for him and his national aspirations towards the presidency if his nemesis, Lucky Luciano, would never return to the United States.
So this secret of New York is that America's top gangster, the crime boss who created the 5 families, was freed by the same man who put him in prison. He's the mafia don who got away. Well, he almost got away.
He was going to write his memoirs, and a film of his life was about to be made, and the script was in the works. So the day he was supposed to meet with the film producer, he keels over after drinking a cup of coffee in Naples airport, and the rumor still is that he may have been poisoned because the mob did not want Lucky Luciano's memoirs to be published.
Luciano's operation wasn't the only game in town. Other mobsters became prominent in the 1920s, including one group that specialized in assassinations, the business of contract killing. They were called the Boys from Brooklyn, labeled by newspapers as Murder Incorporated. One of the founders of Murder Incorporated was Abe Rellis, nicknamed Kid Twist. Maybe it came from the candy he liked to eat, or maybe because his fingers had a habit of twisting around people's necks.
Abe Rellis was a tough guy from the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. He was only 5'2", but he made up in venom what he lacked in size. He was in a parking garage here in Manhattan one day, and the attendant offended him somehow, and he killed him. Stood trial, naturally. He beat the case. Case was fixed. A few months later, in the same parking garage, another attendant offended him, and he beat him to death.
He did his business with an ice pick. That was his weapon of choice. That was not the weapon of choice of everyone, but it was the predominant weapon used by Murder Incorporated if they could get close enough to their victim. Slip up behind, stick ice pick into the base of the skull, and it goes right into the base of the brain, and you're dead. It's quiet, and it's just an ordinary tool. It's not like a gun, which has things that you can trace. Ropes were also used. That was another weapon of choice for Murder Incorporated. Slip behind, do the Garrett situation, and that's the end of it. The rope is a piece of rope, it's nothing else, and can be gotten rid of very easily.
Abe Reles, like many of these murderers, actually enjoyed killing people. That was his business. The Murder Incorporated was an organization that you hired to get rid of your business opponents or your enemies. They would not even know who they were killing or why.
They were very organized. They would do research on the person who was to be killed. They would chart out paths of escape. They would use a crash car, and a crash car was used to follow the car that would carry the killer or killers in it. And in the event that the police were to follow the killers after the murder, the crash car obviously would get in the way or crash the police car, and then the killers would get away. In the space of 10 to 15 years, he and Murder Incorporated were responsible for 80 deaths in Brooklyn, and it said 1,000 deaths nationwide. If someone needed to be killed in another city, they would have the killer. He was called a trooper. He would then meet a person called a finger man, who would finger the mark, the person who needed to be killed. And then the trooper would take his time, lay out what he had to lay out and do the murder, and then simply slip out of town, and all the local mobsters would have alibis, and they would be able to escape whatever heat came on them from the police. So that's why Murder Incorporated was used. They were used all over the country, and they were very, very effective.
Pressure increased to stop the killings, and Brooklyn DA William O'Dwyer, later mayor of New York City, had an informant with enough evidence to put Murder Incorporated behind bars. That led to the arrest of Abe Reles.
Because they were contract killings, Reles knew what was going to happen to him, so he cut a deal, just like every other mobster who has cut a deal to save his own skin. And in this case, he was saving himself from being fried in the electric chair in Sing Sing. And he decided to turn. His testimony wound up being responsible for the electrocution of 7 men. And next on the list was going to be Albert Anastasia, who was one of the co-founders of Murder Incorporated.
Anastasia was the highest-ranking mafia chief Abe Reles was going to betray in return for immunity. The Brooklyn DA's office kept Reles hidden at a Coney Island hotel called the Half Moon. Reles was guarded around the clock by teams of police, and the Brooklyn DA's office was confident they finally had a way to convict Anastasia. But Reles never made it to court.
There were 18 police officers assigned to guard detail in that hotel. 5 were in Reles's apartment that night. They claimed that they had checked him, that he was all right, and then early in the morning when they went around, he was missing, and they saw that he had gone out the window. Some people have said the police threw him out the window. Others said that he had committed suicide. The body, though, was found far out from the window, whereas if he had just fallen, it wouldn't have gone that far. There were a lot of people who wanted him dead.
So this is the suitcase that they found with Abe Reles' body at the Half Moon Hotel.
Yes, it is.
Let's open it up and see what's inside.
Okay.
It looks like bed sheets.
These sheets, bedclothes, whatever you want to call them, blankets, are not strong at all. He was too smart to use these to get to the street from what was the 6th floor, 7th floor of the Half Moon Hotel. The rope, so to speak, was too short. He wasn't going to get to the ground. If he dropped, he would have broken his legs. He was found on the street, away from the building, so it doesn't make sense that he used this to get down.
It sounds like someone gave Reles a push.
Exactly. He was going to testify against the person who founded Murder Incorporated. The mob was out there. Albert Anastasia's people were out there. So he was safe where he was. To leave that room meant certain death for him.
The mob likes to call people who sing in court canaries. Was Abe Reles a canary?
Yes, but when it came time to sing his last song, he never got a chance because he truly was the canary that couldn't fly.
Criminal gangs have always confronted a metropolis like New York, but the 1920s started the greatest gang warfare this city has ever seen, fueled by a flood of illegal liquor. Prohibition lasted 13 years, and it forced ordinary citizens who just wanted a drink to become criminals to get one. Tens of thousands of illegal speakeasies filled the city from top to bottom. But that's another story for another time. Everywhere you turn in this mysterious and beautiful city, there are secrets to be found. All you have to do is look for them. It was the technology that would change entertainment forever.